So these are my current go-to cycling shoes. They're a mid-level Shimano XC3 that run for about 125 bucks. I use them for road and gravel, and I only use SPD cleats to keep things nice and easy when jumping on a bunch of different bikes. Now these, on the other hand, are a pair of Leviathan shoes from the company Strongfeet Athletics, and they claim to be quote-unquote foot-shaped cycling shoes, with the main benefit of having a wider toe box because, quote, strong feet must have space to splay one's toes for optimal force production, agility, power, and balance. Now personally, I was always under the impression that my feet were foot-shaped. But there's an increasing number of brands that have recently been catering toward people with wider feet. Now, admittedly, my feet are what I consider to be on the narrow side to begin with, and so I've actually never had a problem with cycling shoe fitment, and these Shimano shoes here, with proper insoles of course, fit me like a glove. I can do long rides, and when everything else on my body hurts, my feet thankfully never give me any trouble. But the thing is, Strongfeet have been very careful not to call this shoe a shoe for people with wide feet, or a wide shoe per se, because it's not all about making the entire shoe wider. I think the value proposition here is that the Leviathan shoe is shaped in a unique way, where the heel has a relatively traditional fit, and there's a gradual widening toward the toe box, allowing your toes to splay out a little bit more than usual, which will definitely be more comfortable for people whose feet usually feel cramped in the toe area. Now, one thing that's not immediately apparent from looking at the photos on the website is that there's actually just a lot more volume to the shoe in the midfoot section as well. Looking at the profile of these shoes, the Leviathan is much taller than the Shimano, which could also be good if you've got really, we'll say, bulky feet. Now, during the testing period, I've had these set up with SPD cleats, but being that this is the first product from the company, they've actually integrated mounting holes for both road and mountain cleats in the same design to reduce manufacturing costs. So you can actually run these with either style cleat, which is actually kind of nice. So when I first put these shoes on, I immediately noticed the space in the shoe itself. Now the sizing is a little bit strange. I typically run a size 43, which corresponds to about a 9.5 shoe size, which is my normal everyday shoe size, but the Leviathan's equivalent size is a 41. Now you can see here that the length of the Shimano 43 and the Strongfeet 41 are pretty much the same. Now as far as fit, while the Shimano shoe kind of hugs my foot nicely all the way from heel to toe, I was totally swimming in these size 41 Leviathans. Which isn't to say that they'd fall off easily. In fact, the heel cup is nice in that it's got this sort of like one-way gripping design where your foot can easily slide into the shoe, but it encounters a lot of friction when trying to slide out. Now this combined with the high quality FitGo lacing system actually holds my foot in the shoe pretty well. It's just that the front part of my foot from like the midfoot on forward to the toes just have tons of space. Now again, for somebody with really wide feet, I can see this being really comfortable. I rode with them for the first time thinking that maybe as I warm up, as I get the blood flowing a little bit, my feet might expand a little bit and fill out that space, but that just never happened in my case. In fact, for me, what ended up happening for the first few rides is that with all that extra room in the toe box, I was sort of subconsciously using a lot of extra foot muscles that I don't normally use just to keep my toes kind of pushing downward. And my feet actually ached quite a bit after each ride. Now, I don't think I can entirely attribute that to the extra room in the toe box because actually the insole design is pretty different from what I'm used to as well. Whereas like a typical Shimano shoe will have a little bit of contour to the insole, the Leviathan shoes are completely flat, and that's actually by design. So Strongfeet claim that you don't want your big toe to be dorsiflexed during power application, and that a flat shoe is the best way to achieve some kind of balance during cycling. Now, maybe there's just a really long adjustment period, but for me, it never felt particularly optimal to have a totally flat insole. The Leviathan shoes are also incredibly stiff, which is something I'm not entirely accustomed to. And because these foot pads are oriented at the very ends of the heel and the toe, it makes walking really difficult. Whereas a Shimano shoe has a little bit of contour that allows for some natural roll of the foot as you walk. The Leviathan is very rigid, and the contact points are at the very 4.5 points of the toe and the heel, which makes each step a little bit awkward. So all this to say, this particular shoe didn't work for me personally. However, that doesn't mean that it won't work for you. I'd say that the person who's going to benefit most from this shoe is someone who routinely has trouble fitting into a quote-unquote traditional cycling shoe just because the toes end up being super cramped despite the length being the proper size. And I think that might be the case for more people than I had originally thought. I know, for instance, Russ from Pathless Pedal had tried these shoes out because he typically has trouble fitting into, traditional cycling shoes. And I think these shoes ended up fitting his foot pretty well, regardless of whether he ended up using them regularly or not. Now, I think that cycling shoe brands are also starting to release more wide variants of their models, so there's definitely an apparent need for wider shoes in the cycling space. Now, I suppose one of the things that I'm not completely sold on is this concept of differentiating a wide shoe, like the wide variant of many of the Shimano shoes that are available, and a quote-unquote foot-shaped shoe. Now, I think it's really hard to distinguish yourself as a brand in the cycling space, and I believe that Strongfeet are doing a good job setting themselves apart with taking a more holistic approach to posture and foot health overall. But for me personally, a traditional shoe like this Shimano XC3 is very foot-shaped. I almost think that if Strongfeet branded their shoe as simply a cycling shoe for people with wide feet, it might resonate with more people who aren't necessarily invested in all the science behind posture and foot health and just need a wider shoe that fits. So anyways, at $300 US, this is certainly not a cheap shoe, but it's definitely not the most expensive shoe on the market. And as for my experience with them so far, the build quality seems top-notch. I haven't had very many concerns about the construction of the shoe. It seems well designed and well built. Now, one thing that my brother-in-law pointed out, and I think it's a valid point, is that these lace retainers, for lack of a better term, do seem like they could be a potential fail point under high load, especially if you tend to pull upward on the pedals a lot. Now, personally, I haven't experienced any separation at this point here, but it is sort of the one place that I could see being an issue. Now, personally, over the past couple of weeks, I've since gone back to my Shimano SPD shoes. These XC3s are actually getting a bit worn down, and so I have a new pair of RX6s sort of ready to take their place. But again, for anybody with wide feet who routinely have trouble finding cycling shoes with enough space in the toe box, the Strongfeet Leviathans are definitely something to consider. Now, if you have any questions about my experience with the Strongfeet Leviathan shoes, just drop them down below. We'll try and do our best to get back to as many as we can. It's going to do it for this video. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.